Good evening and welcome. And tonight I'm delighted to welcome Patrick Crowley, Rose, Castle and Crown. I've just been talking to him for 10 minutes. This is going to be really, really interesting, or maybe it says a lot about how little I know about the reserves and how it works. Probably a combination of both. This live webinar is being streamed on YouTube. The discussion will take approximately 40 minutes with 20 minutes questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I don't know if many of you know, but we've just started releasing our latest podcast, which is all about Afghanistan and featuring some absolutely fascinating and perhaps quite difficult stories from those that served in Afghanistan. And finally, I would like to thank our funders, as usual, funded by the Armed Forces Covenant Trust Fund and Arts Council England. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Patrick.
Steve, thank you very much. I'll just press the share button and hopefully bring up some slides. Just working our way through. It is working, I hope. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Steve, thanks very much. Right, well, thank you very much, everybody, joining me for a little talk this evening. Very pleased to support the Company of Makers and everything the Company of Makers does. So thanks, Steve. I'm going to talk about the reserves, and I think this is a topic that has not really been talked about very much generally around the place. If you walked into a bookshop and you saw lots of military books, you would not see many about the reserves. And why is that? Well, partly it's because they can be quite complicated to talk about, or people just don't understand. But I hope I'll shed a little bit of light on the reserves, and particularly in relation to Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, but I won't go too deep into that over the next 40 minutes or so. So the book is called Rose, Castle and Crown, and that's basically named after the emblems of Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And it's about the citizen soldiers, the part-time soldiers, if you like, from those counties. But it does an overview story, starting from the beginning of the part-time soldier through to the Army Reserves of today. And it was put together basically by three main groups. It was sponsored by the Duke of Connaught's Trust, which is based down in Hampshire, but supports reserves and cadets in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight and the adjacent counties. Medina Publishers, they are on the Isle of Wight, and they're the ones who published it, obviously. And then there's myself. So basically, the idea was from the Duke of Connaught's Trust, and then the rest of us got on and did it. So that's what the book is all about. And it's a topical subject. If you consider what's going on in the world at the moment, what's happened and is happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East. If you take the Ukrainians, you take the Israelis, they have to mobilize a lot of reservists in order to keep their wars going. And that's one of the sort of themes. How do you generate people? How do you generate soldiers in particular when there is a war on? Now, the part-time soldier was described, as you can see here, by Field Marshal Bill Slim. Many of you will remember he was the boss of the Forgotten Army, the 14th Army, in the Far East during the Second World War, but he also became the chief of the Imperial General Staff. And he made the point that Territorial is twice a citizen, does his ordinary job, but then puts uniform on and does his part for defence. So that's sort of personality, if you like, that I'm talking about this evening. And not everyone knows that the part-time army is much older than the regular army. At one stage, it was very much the duty of everyone to defend your county. And I mean that county because it's very much locally based. And at one time, you could be levied. In other words, you're effectively told you're going to be a part-time soldier defending your local area, or you might have been on a ballot. So your name appeared on the ballot and you had to serve your time as a part-time soldier. In Hampshire, this is just an example, and this would be the same across other counties in the country. The yeomanry, generally, they of course were on horses, and we'll come back to that. The first lot of Hampshire yeomanry were raised in 1794, and as you can imagine, most of the threat, most of the time in these early days, was from France. And then you had various organisations that were mounted volunteers. So these are other volunteers with horses, and you had all sorts of organisations across the country. And one there mentioned is the Droxford Cavalry. It's hard to believe a place, Droxford, is not very big, had its own little cavalry unit. And then you had other volunteers, such as the 1st Hampshire Volunteers, raised in Winchester in 1859, which was another period where there was a threat from France. And also the sort of size, the scale of this. So if I take you to next year, so TBC, you know, what's going to happen next year? There's a Strategic Defence Review running at the moment, which will publish its details in the spring, and it will point its way ahead for the scale of the armed forces. And no doubt we'll talk about the reserve element, the part-time element as well. But on current figures for the Army, those are the sorts of figures there are, both regular and reserve. Then look across to 1800 and you can see the sort of scale there was in the country then, when there was a much smaller population. And the size of the part-time soldiers gone up and down depending on the threat over the years and over the centuries. So if you go back to just before the First World War, 1908, there were 14 mounted brigades and 14 infantry divisions. So if you think of a brigade between 3,000 and 4,000 each, infantry division could be 9,000 or so, 10,000. Then you come forward to just after the Second World War, when the Cold War starts. You've got an anti-aircraft command, and you've got 9 divisions, one of which was airborne, which people forget now, and two armoured. And these are all part-time soldiers. So the scale of the part-time army, if you like, the reserve, has varied a huge amount over the years. But the sacrifices made by the reservist or the territorial, names changed over the years, is sort of summed up by this example. So everyone knows, I'm sure, about the Battle of Gallipoli. There was a particular battle in Gallipoli on the 12th of August in 1915, and three brothers, the Urry brothers, died in that attack. That attack was by the 1st 8th Battalion of the Princess Beatrice's Isle of Wight Rifles of the Hampshire Regiment. They all came from that address in Newport on the Isle of Wight. So whether they were regular or reserve, they were doing their bit. And that is, I think, almost a unique occasion. And I have stood in front of the Gallipoli Memorial where those 3 Urry names are listed. And they're also listed at Carisbrooke Castle. So sacrifices are made by those reservists just in the same way that they were made by the regular. And then this wider theme. So if you had £100 and someone said, I'm going to spend it on defence, what's your balance of the sort of people that you're going to spend that money on? Well, you've got to start off by saying, what's the balance between the 3 services? And they've got to make these decisions in the Strategic Defence Review coming up. And they've made these decisions over the years at other reviews, over the centuries. So what's most important to this country? For a long time, the most important bit of our defence was the Navy, the Royal Navy. And so most of the investment went into the Royal Navy. But when you come to the Army piece, what's the balance of the money you spend? How much do you want to spend on an expensive regular? How much do you want to spend on the auxiliary or part-timer, which is what I'm sort of talking about? Or actually, do you just go for conscription? Force people to serve? And then what's the role of the regular reserve? So some of you on this call will be veterans, and you might have a commitment still for service because you are a regular or strategic reserve. You've done your bit in the regular forces and you could be called up. The civil service, what about the civil service? What about civilian firms? And of course, what about the mercenaries? Russia has been using mercenaries, you know, over in the Ukraine. So what is the balance of that £100 you're going to spend? And this is a problem that has been always there when they're doing reviews on how do you spend your money and what are you going to invest in. So the regular army really takes its history, if you like, from when King Charles II took the throne. We're going back to about 1660 or so. And there's always the debate about which bits of the army would be sent overseas to do tasks and which bits would stay at home. And for quite a period, the regular army was generally used to be garrison the empire, sent overseas to fight battles, whilst the part-time element, if you like, that element was generally used for home defense, because what you could do, of course, is have a strong navy defending the coasts, regular army overseas, and then you'd have the navy. And so if actually someone made it to this country, you'd pull out those part-time soldiers, you mobilize them or embody them and get them on parade, and they would defend the homeland. This was one of the sort of arguments, the best way, value for money, if you like, from both the regular and the part-timer. And if you take a county like Hampshire, eventually there were two regiments of foot, the 37th formed in 1702 and the 67th of foot formed in 1758, that became eventually the Hampshire Regiment, which then becomes today's Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, which I'm lucky enough to be a deputy colonel of. But the foundation of these part-time soldiers comes from three strands, and these are the three strands I shall ask you to follow through on this talk. So you have the militia. Militia is the oldest bit. You've then got the volunteers. Well, they've always sort of been volunteers throughout the time, but the volunteers in particular come into their own from the 1859, 1860 period mainly. And then the yeomanry, and I've already put the sort of date up of where most of the yeomanry were formed, which is around about 1794. So those are the sort of three strands, if you like, of the part-time soldier. And what were you going to use this part-time army for? And that picture shows some Isle of Wight Rifles officers. So, as I said before, to use it for home defence, a defence against invasion. What about internal disorder? Because actually the police forces in this country didn't exist really until the 1830s or so onwards. And so if you had internal disorder and rioting or just problems amongst the people, you'd call in the militia, you'd call in the yeomanry. They were the people who would probably put down that particular problem. Then there was also a feeling that if you trained people, even though they were, if you like, part-time soldiers, there'd be a social effect in the country because they would have greater duty and discipline. So actually people were made better citizens because of the experience. So there was a social benefit of training more people to have military knowledge and experience. And then as time goes on, actually, why not we use some of these people to supplement the regular forces? An example, Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, there were a lot of militia who were sent out to reinforce the regular battalions because they'd run out of the regular troops who had been busy down in the Peninsula War earlier. And then what about conscription? This country does not like conscription historically. But that is arguably the most effective way of gaining more people. But this country doesn't really like it. And so over the years, a lot of the time, we have tried to avoid conscription. In other words, preferred to reinforce the regular with the volunteer reserve. So these are the sort of different ways in which you can use the part-time bit of the army. And each of those soldiers have got to balance their lives as they do now. So they've got their family, they've got their civilian job and career, but also they've got to balance with a soldier in there. And there's a soldier from the Isle of Wight Rifles with his kit, wearing a piece of kit on his head, which was awful at the time, called the Broderick hat. It's basically a number one dress hat without a peak on. It's pretty awful. So let's take the oldest group. So the feared, or became the militia. So if you were in a particular part of your county and you were in an area where the landlord owned this, that and t'other, he would have an obligation to raise people from the local community. And people would expect to have to serve if there was a crisis. And if there was a threat of invasion, they'd be called together. So it's local men with their own weapons. Laws came out as the years went by saying what weapons they had to carry and all the rest of it. So not a sort of highly professional army as such. There might be some mercenaries being used. There might be some of them who spent more time as soldiers than others. And you might have an extremely reliable shield wall in that battle, but with the more experienced ones, and then the others might just be brought in effectively to reinforce. And the feared was something that was used when we were invaded in 1066, and it was successful in the north of England in one battle, but not so successful when it came to the Battle of Hastings. And so this fear develops into the militia, as I said. So you could find yourself in your village basically having to serve some of your time as a standby soldier, and you'd parade occasionally under the muster master, who would be an very experienced soldier who would put you through your paces with your particular weapon and so on. And it was handy. At one stage, everyone learned how to handle the longbow. So training on the longbow meant you had a whole bunch of people who could at least fire a weapon, even though they didn't perhaps know much about tactics. And as time went on, the shape of this changed a bit. So in 1757, there was a ballot system. So it wasn't a levy as such in the same way as before, but you could find yourself on a list and then have to serve as a part-time soldier. And again, this was going all around the country, but at that time in the south, in the Hampshire area, you had the North Hampshire militia, the South Hampshire militia, and the Isle of Wight militia. So you could have that all around the country in different groups, different names, different counties. Primarily there for home defence, but also could provide recruits for the regular army. And I've put there the county lieutenancy until 1871 because when these groups started off, at one stage they were commanded by the sheriff of the county, and then when the lord lieutenants that developed over the centuries from about the early 16th century, they had the responsibility of these part-time soldiers, and so the lord lieutenant could command the militia, the yeomanry, and the volunteers, could appoint them, could commission them, had enormous power with that locally raised group of people who would defend that county. And they retained that power until about 1871. So, a long time, until eventually the part-time soldier gets more integrated into the regular force, as it's much more integrated today. But that was a process that took a while. On the right there, you can see a memorial, which is just outside Winchester Cathedral. So some of you may have seen that at some stage. As you can see, Thomas Fletcher, a grenadier in the North Regiment of Hampshire Militia, who died of a violent fever contracted by drinking small beer when hot on the 12th of May, 1764. So it's a famous monument. But one of the reasons why it's famous is because one of the people who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, it reputedly looked at that, and that's one of the reasons why that person decided to set up Alcohols at the AA. So a little bit of militia. And so the militia gets embodied when we go to war. So embodied is just an old-fashioned name for being mobilized. And there were groups of artillery, engineers, and infantry, just those three really. And you can see, I'm not going to go through all those wars, but those were the sorts of things that they were being mobilized for, because often they were backfilling the regular troops who were being deployed on operations, if you like. So regular troops deployed on operations, militia embodied. Militia would take over guarding locations in this country. We forget these days, but we had all sorts of forts with gun positions around the country that had to be manned. And some of them would also end up going out overseas, volunteering to go off with those regular units and supplement the regular units. So all that sort of thing was going on, as you can see, through to the South African War. Meanwhile, the yeomanry are set up around about 1794. That's a sort of broad date across the country for different yeomanry regiments. And you end up, let's say, with unusually sounding names. There's one for the Isle of Wight, the Loyal Vectis Light Dragoons. Doesn't sound real. Something out of Warhammer, perhaps. And you end up with 1887, the Hampshire Yeomanry Cavalry. And I've already mentioned they could be used for aid to the civil power. So if we go back to, there were all sorts of agricultural disputes going on in the 19th century, early 19th century in this country. And it's a bit like the equivalent of AI coming in now. Machines were coming in, and the machines were replacing people. And so there were all sorts of small riots going on because people didn't like that, because they were losing their jobs. So what do you call in? You call in the yeomanry, call in the militia if there aren't any regular troops, or you supplement the regular troops. So that is one of the reasons why they were used. There were also bread riots and various other things. So these people were brought in to assist, to quell the problem. And then the volunteers, and they had a motto, defense, not defiance. And there, you might be surprised to see a bunch of them on bicycles and you can see the rifle positioned on brackets there. Actually, the bicycle was pretty useful for getting around the countryside on roads and so on, quicker than walking. But the volunteers, they'd been volunteers a long time before. When the Napoleonic Wars were on, whilst they had the militia, they also asked for volunteers for more troops. But this time around, the main period of when these volunteers were raised was from 1859 onwards. And again, it was a threat from France. And you have an example there of an organisation, the Hampshire Rifle Volunteers from Winchester, or the Isle of Wight Volunteers. But that was happening all around the countryside. Vast amounts of people volunteering to be soldiers and to be used when required for home defence, in this case, against any potential French invasion. And they eventually become, those particular ones, the 1st to the 5th volunteer battalions of the Hampshire Regiment in 1885. And this is across the country. So again, these volunteers start integrating with the regulars. So I've talked about militia, and the yeomanry, and now the volunteers. And their main use overseas was when many of them volunteered for the war in South Africa against the Boers. And this involves the regular troops being sent out in vast amounts to South Africa. And they just run out of troops. So we're back to, how do you generate people? They needed more people. And there was an appeal for more troops. And so a source of this were the militia, the yeomanry, and the volunteers. And there we see one heading off to war. So in South Africa, you ended up, and I'm taking the example again from Hampshire, but it could be the same from other counties because it was all very similar. You had the Imperial Yeomanry. So they slightly changed the name of that. So Imperial Yeomanry, and there were 2 companies from Hampshire, the 41st and the 50th. You then had 2nd Hampshire, which was a regular battalion, was deployed, but it had a group of volunteers to supplement, to boost their numbers, if you like, within the regular unit. And there's nothing new what sometimes happens today there. Then you had militia reinforcement, and you also had sappers and gunners going out to support. And in fact, an example of their sort of integrated use was there was a significant railway accident that occurred during this war with the Hampshire Regiment on board. So it's mainly 2nd Hampshire. But the deaths from that road accident, the rail accident, which is pretty serious, were between about 40 and 50 deaths. There was a mixture of regular, volunteer, and militia in the same accident, which just goes to show that they were being used and being integrated. And I've got a picture of a yeomanry officer on the side there, because this is just to illustrate some of the personalities that would appear commanding these volunteer units. And this is a guy called Jack Seeley, and those are his years of life. But he joined the Hampshire Carabinieri as a young officer. Whilst he was in South Africa, he was quite a character. On the way to South Africa, he took his own horse down to the boat that was going to take them across to South Africa. And the horse was basically a grey horse, almost white. And the administrators wouldn't let him take his horse on board. So he basically went around the corner and sprayed it brown and took it to war. So he was a character, and he almost was sacked because of disobeying an order in a particular Boer attack when he was told to withdraw, but he didn't, and he carried on fighting. It was one of those people who he was either going to get sacked or he was going to get the DSO, and he got the DSO in this particular case. But he goes on to command the Canadian Cavalry Brigade in the First World War, and takes another horse to that war, and that effectively is the real war horse, which survives the First World War. But this character was also MP for the Isle of Wight, Secretary of State for War for a period, became the first Baron Motterston, was the Law Lieutenant of Hampshire, and married a lady called Emily, who's the daughter of Sir Harry Crichton, which will come on to the next one. But just to give you an idea, really, of some of the characters that were in this game. And here's Sir Harry Crichton, who he's married into. So he's an typical cavalryman-looking person there, perhaps. Ex-regular hussar, commanding officer of the Hampshire Carabiniers, but also of the Hampshire Infantry Brigade and the Portsmouth Volunteer Infantry Brigade. Those are part-time, if you like, organisations. But he was also very well known locally as a commodore of the Royal Yacht, a member of your Royal Yacht Squadron, a chair of the County Territorial Association, which I'll come back to, owner of Netley Castle, those of you who know that area, and built the church down there, a county commissioner of scouts, and his second wife was the daughter of the Viceroy of India. It just gives you a feel for some of the characters that appeared in this. Anyway, I'll take you forward now from the Boer War. The Boer War was a disaster for both for the British Army in a big way. There were lots of things that had to be reorganised after that war. Soldiers had fought hard, but the army wasn't organised properly for war. The army was organised for fighting in the empire and dealing with, if you like, just bigger than police type issues, dealing with various problems in different countries around the world, but not for fighting as an army in a conventional war. It needed a real sort out, and it was sorted out from the strategic level right down to the tactical level in all sorts of ways. But the person who really sorted out the part-time piece in particular was Richard Haldane. So he was the Secretary of State for War, and in 1908 he made a major reform, and he brought together the yeomanry, the volunteers, and the militia. And effectively, he forms the Territorial Force. So that's where the name comes in 1908. So the militia, he converts to what's called a special reserve, if you like, a slightly more ready group to mobilize, to reinforce regulars when they go to war. He also formed the Officer Training Corps, which was and is still in now universities. But at that stage, you had a senior bit and a junior bit. Junior bit was in schools as cadets, if you like. And he also, as I said, wrapped the yeomanry and volunteers into the Territorial Force. And he also created what were called the county associations. Now, I'm the chief executive of a thing now called the South East Reserve Forces Cadet Association. In those days, they were separate Hampshire County Association. Every county had its own association, and there were 94. Now we're down to 13 across the whole country, and they got slightly different roles. But basically, what it was, the regular army, the army, sorted out operations and training, whilst the county associations did all the admin behind. So they did the recruiting, they did the buildings, they sorted out money, they sorted out the horses that were required, the fodder, and all that sort of thing, whilst the chain of command just thought about going to war and training. And so the Surfka bit, we still exist now, but we do slightly different things than we did then. So big thing, 1908, formation of the Territorial Force. And so if you took a typical regiment, and I'm again using the Hampshire Regiment as the example, but it could have been anywhere around the country. In most regiments at this stage, just before the First World War, as a result of Haldane reforms and things, you had one or two, normally two, regular battalions. Then you had the Special Reserve Battalion, which was the old militia, which reinforced people when they went to war. And then you had the next echelons, if you like, of Territorial Force. And they were further integrated. So you can see the Territorial Force becomes 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Territorial Battalions. And then slightly later, there's a 9th Cyclist Battalion. So because of what Haldane did before the First World War, our army, both regular and reserve, was really well structured for going to war as a result of what he had achieved. So what happened when you go to the First World War? I'm not going to go through all those in detail, I promise. But as the First World War starts, the regulars are all sent to the Western Front, effectively, and the territorials are sent overseas generally to garrison locations in order to relieve the regulars to come back to go to the Western Front. That's what it started off like. People have always known that the part-time soldier needs more training to get him up to speed, him or her up to speed. So the idea was send them overseas where they can get themselves sorted out and bring the regulars back. And so one of the Hampshire Territorial battalions goes to India and effectively takes over the barracks of a regular battalion that comes back to go to the Western Front. The problem is life's not as simple as that. And the regular pot of soldiers gets used up pretty quickly in the First World War. And they need other soldiers to come in to hold the line. And so on the Western Front, you find that the territorials and empire troops, a lot of them from India, fill the gap, particularly in 1915, after all the casualties in the regular army in 1940. And meanwhile, people are thinking of how else do you hit the enemy? And you can hit the enemy not only on the Western Front, but also in other parts of the world. And so these soldiers that are sent out to garrison, particularly garrisoning India, end up going on other campaigns. And some of those campaigns are listed on the left there. You also have a Kitchener factor. So everyone remembers Lord Kitchener, we need you and all that sort of thing. As the First World War starts, you have the regular army deployed. You have the territorial force sent out mainly overseas, but also to reinforce, as I just said. But Kitchener asks for more people to volunteer. So you end up with Kitchener's armies, which are basically people, civilians coming off the street, rather like the Ukrainians, coming off the street and volunteering to join up. And they are Kitchener's armies. And they're like a separate group. They're not territorials. They're a separate group that are trained up. And they really come into their own in 1916 in the Battle of the Somme. So 1915, the territorial and those empire troops was absolutely critical to hold the line on the Western Front. But a lot was going on overseas, and there's some of the places. And I mentioned one. I've actually written a book about Mesopotamia in 1916. Basically, the 1st 4th Battalion of the Hampshire Regiment was sent out to India, and along with others from India, obviously controlled by Britain, went to take over the oil fields in the Fao Peninsula. That might remind people of a few things later on in Iraq, in the Fao Peninsula, and end up moving up the River Tigris, which I hope you can see on the map there, through Basra, which many of you will know, up the River Tigris, heading towards Baghdad, but never quite reaching Baghdad. So an army heads off in that direction. And basically, they start off really well. It's a mixture of regulars, of territorials, and Indian army troops. They push up towards Baghdad, don't quite reach Baghdad, then have to pull back to a town called Kut, which is on the River Tigris. They get surrounded. They are besieged by the Turks, the Ottomans, for a number of months, and then surrender. One of the biggest disasters of the First World War that's not known by everybody. But basically, the 1st 4th Hampshires were split between the garrison in Kut that eventually had to surrender and the relief force that never quite got through. Later, there were lots of success in Mesopotamia, but this was not the greatest hour. And I just pick out a character there, RSM Billy Leach, of the 1st 4th Hampshires, went into captivity. He was a school teacher in Hampshire and was a territorial. And basically, he was the RSM of the battalion. And he ended up keeping alive many of the soldiers right up until the end of the First World War, because many of them were used on railways, a bit like the Japanese in the Second World War, and doing basic tasks and so on. But unfortunately, just before the war finishes, he himself dies from ill health. But there's an example of another part-timer doing his bit during the First World War. I'll flick forward now, looking at the time, looking forward to the in between the two wars. Well, after the First World War, they reformed the Territorial Army. It's called the Territorial Army as opposed to Territorial Force. Not a good time to join the armed forces at this stage, because someone brought out a 10-year rule saying that there would not be a war for at least 10 years. Well, you're not going to get much money for your finances if someone said that politically. So it wasn't an easy period, but the Territorial Army was there, as was the regular army. They actually took over the role of anti-aircraft, manning anti-aircraft weapons, like as shown in the picture. And those weapons were really important when it came to the Second World War. So they were armed, they were manned by territorials, including women, because part-time women soldiers come more into their own as we go forward here. They're also responsible for coast defense and guns on the coast. So again, changing shape as the Second World War approaches. And then the Second World War approaches, and basically they go for integration. So when the war starts, there are territorial formations that are sent out to France in 1940, as they did with the regulars. They had various tasks behind the scenes mainly, but then they had to fight as well. Some of them were sent to Norway. But the bottom line was, at the beginning of the Second World War, integration was the cry, because they realized, as a result of the experience of the First World War, conscription and integration were key to generate manpower. Because what happened in the First World War, so back to there very briefly, you had regulars, followed by territorials, followed by Kitchener's armies. But then in 1916, they had to bring in conscription to generate even more people. So the lesson had been learned. So when they got to the Second World War, it was conscription straight away. But there were reserve, if you like, territorial units that were sent out. It just people got more mixed up, but they kept the names. And so one from Hampshire was the 69th Anti-Tank Regiment of Royal Artillery, which took part in the defence of Boulogne. I've already mentioned anti-aircraft was key. It wasn't just the Royal Air Force winning the Battle of Britain. You needed anti-aircraft weapons. You needed radar. You needed the Royal Navy out there and everything else. And you also needed searchlight units, which were manned by the territorials, and the coastal defence. And let's not forget the Home Guard. They were not all Captain Mannerings, etc. The Home Guard was absolutely critical in homeland defence in this country during the Second World War. Again, people who were doing it on a voluntary basis, effectively. Meanwhile, you had other units that were sent out to North Africa, Italy, Normandy, Northwest Europe. And if you take the example of, again, the Hampshire Regiment as it was then, 2 out of 3 Hampshire Regiment Victoria Crosses from the Second World War were actually territorials, which is interesting. One of them was Major David Wakefield, who's in that picture. Moving on to after the war, and then we have sort of changing ideas about things. So after the Second World War, you still needed lots of people for the defense of this country, but also the empire was sort of gradually, we were withdrawing from empire, and there were things happening in those countries, and there weren't enough people again. So guess what? As the Cold War starts, national service, conscription continues and goes up to the early 60s. And then there was a feel that, well, hang on, if the Russians are going to start lobbing nuclear weapons at us at some stage, what's the point of having loads of troops? And so people sort of pulled back from numbers and concentrated more on the nuclear defense, if you like, of this country. So there were major cuts in the 1960s. Basically, the government couldn't afford it, and people sort of pulled back, said, well, we've got the nuclear defense, haven't we? Nuclear deterrent. And then we come to the early 70s and then expansion. And so in the south of England, you end up with 1 Wessex, for example, and 2 Wessex. And one of them was NATO rolled, and one of them was home defense rolled. And so there was a period of time in the 70s into the 80s, which some of you watching may remember, where if you were in a particular unit in the TA, Territorial Army, you'd deploy to Germany and you almost knew exactly where your hole was going to be dug to defend against the Russians. On the other hand, you knew that when you were deployed, mobilized in another unit, you might be defending key locations, radar sort of masts and communication masts around the country. So that was how it was at that time. And you even had the Home Service Force that came in, which was basically people being almost issued a weapon and a uniform, and told they were going to defend a key point, again, a communication tower or something, if things got bad and the Soviet Spetsnaz were going to come out of the sky against you, and so on. And then we change again. So we shift to the hotter wars, if you like, and more use of reservists for the Gulf. So it starts off at the Balkans, Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, percentages went up of how many territorials were used, part-time soldiers, if you like, in that period. And I'm coming to the last slide again, looking at the time. So there's always been a challenge with the part-time soldier about culture, integration, and role. And that's a theme that you find throughout the book I wrote. Nothing has changed. And the way people talk of each other is sometimes not ideal. So you've all heard of the acronym ARAB, another regular army bastard, or STAB, a stupid TA bastard. That's all rubbish, of course, because when people are actually deployed and trained and work together, those sort of prejudices soon disappear as people have to fight together. But that cultural gap is always there until people work together. It's just how it is. So the integration point has been really important and continues to be really important. I suspect in the Strategic Defence Review of next year, there'll be more talk of integration, because people then understand each other better. And during those more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, people have mixed with reservists. And there's a better regular and not so good regular, and the same detail with the reservists, and people get to know their strengths and weaknesses, and people work together anyway. But you can see that prior to 1908, everything was rather split in different groups. They certainly weren't integrated. There were lots of different groups around the country for home defence doing their own thing, almost wearing different uniforms as well. So very much separate from the regular forces. Then you had that major reorganisation for the First World War, which was, really, really effective, and they had their slot there. Then you have total integration for the Second World War with conscription and so on. A change again for the Cold War, where people are trying to make savings and think we can defend ourselves without too many people. And then you have further studies. And so there was something called Future Reserves 2020 that pointed the reserves to the shape they are just at the moment. And then more recently, there was something produced called Reserve Forces 2030, which has changed its name and way ahead a bit recently, and will be sort of integrated within the next Strategic Defence Review as it comes out next year. But guess what? They're saying how much of the reserve should be used for warfighting, how much should be used for resilience, how much should be used for operations other than war, how much should be used for just specialist and niche skills. This is nothing new. If you look at the book, if you actually want to read the book, you'll find these same arguments have been going on for years and years. But ultimately, where are you going to find the people from if you're going to go to war? You will not have all the regulars there. And I sort of come back to the beginning again. Regulars start the war, reserves finish it. And I hope that was a little bit of food for thought. And I hope I haven't banged on too long, Steve.
Not at all. Thank you very much. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, then everybody can see us in full glorious Technicolor. So if anybody's got a question, please put it in the question and answers, and we'll get through as many of those as we possibly can. But I've got a couple of questions for sure. And I would just like to say that was a fascinating talk, and I can confirm that my knowledge of the reserves is much better than it was prior to this talk. So one of the things, a good friend of ours, Mike, who's a former submariner, 30 odd years in the Royal Navy, he's always talking about sea blindness in that the general public doesn't necessarily know what the Royal Navy does. Do you think there's a reservist blindness? Does the general public know what the reservists do and what they're for?
I think in general terms, no, but a lot of the time they don't understand what the regular's for either. There are some places you don't see many people in uniform. Simple as that. I mean, in some places, the only place you might see people in uniform are cadets. And so we're quite separate sometimes when you're looking at regulars tend to be in specific barracks, And so the people around those barracks probably get to know the regulars. The reservists, you know, they're coming in for the evening. You know, it's winter now, so they probably won't see them. They'll form up and go out somewhere to a training area to train. So it is, yes, I think that there is, but I think that's more general across all the services, because quite simply there are less people now, and this is easy to say, I know, but who know people in the forces, who are serving, and so quite simply, you know, they just don't see the military as much as they used to. Let alone understanding what a reservist does.
But that's a challenge for recruitment, I would have thought, not knowing what these organisations actually do, especially in the modern day and age where things are obviously changing a lot. I want to come back to the conscription question, because you mentioned that we as a country don't do conscription unless it's in dire need. Why is that? Why? Because when we're looking at, say, some of the Eastern European countries at the moment, and obviously the situation in the Ukraine, clearly people are being trained up, not necessarily as a full-time reservist, but it's almost like part-time courses in some of the Nordic countries for learning how to handle a weapon, for example. Why is it we don't do anything like that? So from conscription all the way through to some useful skills that you might need if it all goes horribly wrong?
Well, I think there's a combination of reasons. I think fundamentally British people don't like being told what to do. So there's a simple one to start off with. You can go back to history, to Cromwell. You know, so we're going way back in history to Cromwell, but that was the rule of the generals, and people didn't like that. And so you then also go through periods where the military hasn't been very obvious. So the Northern Ireland forced everyone to take their uniforms off and keep a low profile all the time. I think it's just a combination of things, really. I think if people understood what the threat was, understood how they could contribute, and the messaging got out, and they realised that it was essential, then I think actually the country's always come to the fore and done its bit when it's had to. But it's people understanding when that is the case, when they're going to be needed, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so we have already got some questions, which is good. I've got something here from Ian Millen. I know Ian Millen, actually. Hi, Ian. He's the chief exec, head honcho of Veterans Outreach Support here in Portsmouth. But I'll read what he has to say. Thank you for a great presentation, Colonel Patrick. When I was based in the USA in the mid-1990s, reserve forces were indistinguishable from regular forces. It never felt that way here in the UK, even though reservists so often face the same threats. Are things much better today, in your opinion? How can we make things better, if they're not, I assume? At our charity, Veterans Outreach Support, reservists are very much part of our beneficiary cohort. Sounds a bit like Steve's question on research on reserve blindness. And that actually was kind of part of my thinking, is it wouldn't be uncommon to hear a reservist say that they're not entitled to support if they, had a bad experience on deployment, for example, or needed support post-service. So some multiple questions in there, I'm afraid, which is bad on my interview technique. But any comments on what Ian's said there?
Yeah, I think it just depends. It depends on history, what's happened. So if you take, actually, the reservists were quite to the fore when you took the COVID response. So there were reservists being used who were jabbing things, into people's arms or whatever it was. So the reservists were being seen to be used there. Reservists have been seen to be used in certain parts of the country for flooding. An example would be a few years ago, it's not that long ago, but 7 Rifles did a lot of stuff in Hampshire. And they were seen, and people saw that they were reservists. And the same applies to the other 2 services, by the way, not just the Army. So when they're used and seen to be used, you can argue the profile goes up and people have a greater understanding. So it does help that they're used. And most people who are signed up to be an Army reservist or any reservist do actually want to be used if it's required. And part of the frustration over the years has always been, well, I wanted to do that, but I wasn't allowed to. There are specific reservists, particularly on the specialist side, that are absolutely vital. And the intelligence corps is very much integrated into the requirements of defence. And soldiers who join the intelligence corps, the military intelligence units, they end up dealing with real issues. So they enjoy what they do, and other intelligence experts realize they're doing a really good job. And as I said, if you deploy and you mix with your regular colleagues and you're integrated and so on, then they see what you do. Come back to specialists again. Medics, there are all sorts of specialist medics that are absolutely vital for the services to function. They just couldn't without them, and so they are seen as well. So is it better or is it worse? I would say it varies from period to period. So when Iraq and Afghanistan was going on, people always knew there was a reasonable percentage of reservists being used for those tasks. At the moment, there are reservists being used to train Ukrainians. They are out there doing stuff, but I suppose we don't often hear about it. And that's the challenge. So there is better integration now, but there could be even better integration, but it requires people to be used and seen to be worked side by side, I think.
Thank you. There's a question here from Polly. Research in the early 2000s indicated that reserves were at higher risk of mental health consequences after deployment. What are they doing to moderate the risks or mitigate the risks? And is that still a challenge?
Right, I'm not an expert in that. So Polly, let me say I'm not an expert in that. What I would say is that generally people do better in their jobs when they're under pressure if they've had appropriate training. And often if someone doesn't do so well, it's often because they can't fall back on training when they're under pressure necessarily. So I would say that the training bit, just to do your job properly and to be coping with pressure, is absolutely critical, and probably is better in some circumstances than others, depending on how fast people want extra people to be brought in. Certainly the backup to a reservist now is much more integrated in terms of what that reservist can ask for support than it used to be. It's probably not as good as it should be, but it's better than it used to be. And all sorts of things have changed since then. It's a bit like, reservists get pensions now when they're from service and things. All sorts of terms and conditions of service have changed as well dramatically in the last few years, but more can be done.
Yeah, I think we're talking 24 years ago. I think all the services have improved their support for those suffering from mental health challenges. Not saying it's perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there are improvements being made, and not just within the armed forces communities, more widely. I think mental health services and encouraging people to address those issues if they can.
Another aspect to that is, of course, that whilst a regular probably finishes their tour and stays within the community of support and has the backup locally and perhaps the barrack area of this, that, and the other, of course, the reservist has got the additional challenge of going back into normal life, perhaps nowhere near a military and the backup and so on. And therefore, it's a challenge maintaining all the same sort of support for a reservist as you would for a regular. Sorry, following on again from Polly's question.
No, absolutely. I think it's fair to say that reservists do experience unique challenges by the nature of their role and then how they're used. There's no doubt about that, I think. Jeffrey says, from my experience of serving in the TA in an infantry battalion from 78 to 93, and then as a member of Specialist Pool, the biggest problem we had was recruiting. Overtime drill halls were closed, which then meant we lost the recruiting potential from the town. How do we resolve that?
Oh, good. That's a good question. I think if everyone knew that, they'd be great. Well, the recruiting effort is always a huge challenge. It's as simple as that. And the emphasis, of course, is on regional recruiting, because that's where most of the drill halls, if you want to call them that, Army Reserve Centres are. So that's the whole point. Although they're not called the Territorial Army anymore, they are still mainly territorial. So there are national units, specialists, which recruit from all around the country. And there are others, many others, most, who are split around the country, based in their local town or whatever. It's a real problem. There's no silver bullet to it. Everyone's always trying to use technology to best effect to recruit people. The best way to recruit to be frank, is to have role models out there. And then there's the challenge of who's paying for that and all the rest of it. But it's also retention. And if a unit does something worthwhile, and when someone turns up late at night, having done a 5-day week in their civvy job, in the dark, in some strange place, or even having to dig a trench in the dark, do you know what I mean? That sort of conditions, in the rain. Why would they carry on doing that? Well, they're only going to carry on doing that if they enjoy what they're doing and think it's worthwhile. And a lot of the challenges are when, if a unit doesn't provide challenging and interesting training. Actually, the reservists sometimes can get the best of both worlds, better than a regular, because they can almost pick and choose the things they want to do some of the time, which gives them an advantage. And also, being a reservist, they can add skills and confidence and training to themselves, which puts them in good stead, transferable skills to their civvy job. So there's all sorts of things going for it. There's no silver bullet. Lots of people are working at it. It is a challenge recruiting both regular and reservists. And yeah, to be frank, it's all about making it worthwhile for the person they're trying to bring in.
So what does your role involve, Patrick? What do you do in this? You said to me you did lots of travel, but nothing very exciting, Kent and Buckinghamshire and what have you. But joking aside, what's your actual role, and obviously including the cadet force as well?
Well, around the country, I talked about the territorial associations. They changed their names as the years went by, and eventually they became something called TAVRAs, which were Territorial Army Volunteer Reserve Associations, and then became RFCAs, Reserve Force Cadet Associations. So there are 13 around the country, and we are behind the scenes supporting the reserves and the cadets tri-service. So we do all sorts of things. We have 3 core outputs. One is buildings, which is not very exciting, but is important. So a drill hall or a cadet hut or whatever, maintaining and trying to keep it going, keep it open. We also are the lead for the Defence Employer Relationship Scheme, which means that firms can sign up perhaps the Armed Forces Covenant, but then move on to the Employer Recognition Scheme, bronze, silver and gold level. So we take the lead on that on defence, and that supports in particular reservists, because to gain organisations to gain a silver and above award, silver and gold, they have to give time off, paid time off to reservists to train, for example. That didn't exist a few years ago, but it does now. And to be a gold, they have to be an advocate for defence and the reserves and so on. So we do engagement, and that includes community engagement. So we have links into civil military partnership groups run by councils, and we try and present to the community the things that we do to support the reserves and cadets. And then the third strand, so buildings, engagement is cadets. And the Ministry of Defence sponsors 5 main lots of cadets, combined cadet forces at schools. Traditionally was private schools, but they're now more state school CCF pupils than private. You then got the Army Cadet Force, the Sea Cadet Corps, the Volunteer Cadet Corps, and the Royal Air Force Air Cadets Air Training Corps. So we support those cadets in different ways. So I do that across 9 counties of the southeast of England, but there's 13 of these organisations. Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a lot to do, if you ask me. I've got a sort of another question here from Ian. Is it correct that reservists don't have access to service doctors, dentists, and mental health services such as DCMH?
That's quite a technical question, which I won't answer direct, I'm afraid, because it's quite complicated. But there is access, but it's slightly different to the regular. Much as I can say, pretty.
Okay. So that's it, I think. I think that's been absolutely fascinating, Patrick. I've learned a lot. I would actually like to carry on this conversation outside of this call, actually. So I will definitely send you an email. I think we should have a chat and see if there's any way we can work together, because I think that would be quite interesting. I just say thank you for the audience for coming. I've just had another question come through. It'd be rude not to do it, wouldn't it? Is there much difference in the perception of reservists between those who were former full-time military and those who were just, inverted commas, reservists?
There's strengths and weaknesses of both. And that's not just a sort of a political answer, but there's strengths and weaknesses of both, because there have been more regulars coming across to the reserves in recent years. And that's good, because they bring with them all the skills that they built up over the years. So that's absolutely brilliant. But a reservist comes with a lot of other skills. Some of the skills a reservist comes from will be from their civilian occupation, for example, which the regular doesn't have. And so they're bringing a whole different dimension of skills to complement the regular. So actually, you're better off having a good mixture of both.
Thank you. Ian says thank you. Dave says thank you. I say thank you. Fascinating talk. I've learned a lot. Let's talk again, Patrick, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.